46 years ago, an 11-year-old girl in Newport Beach, California left summer school on a warm afternoon and began walking home. She never arrived. A single witness saw her standing beside a turquoise van, talking to the driver. No license plate, no name, no further description beyond the color of the van and the rough age of the man behind the wheel. For 46 years, that turquoise van was all investigators had. Then, in 2018, on the exact anniversary of the day she disappeared, a police department did something no law enforcement agency in America had ever done on social media, and what happened next changed everything. In the summer of 1973, America was exhaling. The last American combat troops had come home from Vietnam that March the 1st. Summer in a decade where the country was no longer sending its young men to Southeast Asia. The beaches of Southern California were full. The war felt like it was finally behind them. In Newport Beach, an affluent coastal city in Orange County, where houses overlooked the Pacific and neighbors left their front doors unlocked. The summer of 1973 had the particular feeling of a place that had never expected to be touched by violence. People bought homes here because it was safe. They sent their children to summer school here because the streets were familiar. Linda Ann O'Keefe was 11 years old that summer. She lived in Corona del Mar, a small coastal community bordering Newport Beach, and she was attending summer school at Lincoln Intermediate School, a school she knew well, with friends she already had. On streets she had walked many times before, people who knew Linda described the same things. She loved piano. She loved painting. She loved crafts. She was a cheerful, curious girl who had just finished 5th grade and was spending part of her summer in class so she could get ahead. On the afternoon of July 6, 1973, the last day of her school week, Linda Ann O'Keefe left Lincoln Intermediate School and began walking home. No one recorded exactly what time she left. No one saw how far she had walked before it happened. What investigators know is this: at some point on that afternoon, a witness saw Linda Ann O'Keefe standing beside a turquoise van on the side of the road, talking to the driver. A white man, the witness said, approximately mid-20s to early 30s, sitting behind the wheel of the van. The witness did not see Linda get into the van, did not see which direction the van drove. There was no license plate noted, no further details about the man, only his race, his approximate age, and the color of the vehicle. That was the last confirmed sighting of Linda Ann O'Keefe alive. When Linda did not come home that evening, her family waited. Then they grew worried. Then they called the Newport Beach Police Department. The search began that night. It ended the following morning in the worst possible way. On the morning of July 7, 1973, less than 24 hours after Linda left Lincoln Intermediate School and did not make it home, 2 men riding bicycles along Back Bay Drive found her body in a ditch near the nature trail on the edge of Newport Beach's Back Bay. She was wearing the same white dress with light blue flowers she had worn to school the day before. The autopsy determined that Linda Ann O'Keefe had been abducted, sexually assaulted, and strangled to death. The 11-year-old girl who had been walking home from summer school on a familiar street in a community where people did not lock their doors had been murdered and left in the wilderness less than 2 miles from her home. What happened next? In those first hours at the crime scene would turn out to be the single most important decision of the entire 46-year investigation. Newport Beach forensic scientist Jim White collected and preserved biological evidence from Linda's body at the scene. In 1973, DNA technology in criminal investigations did not exist. There was no CODIS, no national DNA database. There was no concept that biological material preserved from a crime scene could one day identify a killer by name. Jim White did not know about genetic genealogy. He did not know about family tree. He did not know about Parabon nanolabs. He simply knew that evidence must be preserved. So he preserved it. That decision made by one man following professional instinct in a world that had none of the tools to use what he was collecting would become, 46 years later, the sole foundation on which this case was finally solved. In the weeks and months after Linda's body was found, Newport Beach investigators pursued every available lead. They questioned men matching the witness description. They searched California vehicle registration records for turquoise vans. They canvassed the Corona del Mar area for anyone who might have seen the van that afternoon. They found nothing strong enough to move the case forward. Linda's killer had no criminal record in California at the time, no name in any database. Investigators were searching. What they did not know was that he had already left California shortly after the murder, moved across the country, and was in the process of doing something deliberate and calculated. Changing his name, the man Newport Beach PD was searching for had ceased to exist, at least on paper, and yet Linda Ann O'Keefe's photo went up on the wall of the Newport Beach Police Department, not as a regulation, not because a rule required it, because the people who worked there made a silent commitment that the 11-year-old girl in that photograph had not received justice, and that commitment would pass from one generation of officers to the next. For the next 4.5 decades, her face stayed on that wall for 46 years. The man who sat behind the wheel of the turquoise van on the afternoon of July 6, 1973 was named James Albert Leighton Jr. He was 26 years old at the time of Linda's murder. He had been born in Chicago on July 28, 1946, and had moved to Southern California with his family before the killing. He was working in construction in Orange County, not someone the Newport Beach community knew well, not someone with deep local roots. A man who passed through without leaving a lasting impression on anyone who might later connect his face to a description. He was not unknown to law enforcement. However, James Albert Leighton Jr. had been arrested more than a dozen times in California from 1959 onwards. Burglary, fraud, violations, a pattern of offending that stretched back to his teenage years. A probation officer who assessed him in 1966, when Leighton was 19 and awaiting sentencing for burglary, wrote in his file that he had a difficult time forming relationships with his parents or anyone around him, and had trouble holding down a job. Leighton was on parole in 1973 at the time he killed Linda O'Keefe. In the immediate weeks after the murder. While Newport Beach investigators searched for a man with a turquoise van, Leighton left California. He moved to Florida. At some point in Florida, following an unspecified criminal incident there, he made a decision that would effectively erase him from any investigation. Searching for James Albert Leighton Jr., he changed his name. From that point forward, he was James Allen Neal, not a correction, not a legal adjustment, a calculated severance designed to put permanent distance between the man who had killed an 11-year-old girl on a California street and any investigator who might one day run that name through a database. James Albert Leighton Jr., the name in Newport Beach's case file, no longer appeared in records. James Allen Neal, the man who had killed Linda O'Keefe, eventually settled in Colorado, in the small town of Monument near Colorado Springs, and lived the quiet life of an older man, registered to vote, known to his neighbors, employed, but the pattern that produced the murder of Linda O'Keefe in 1973 had not gone away. From 1995 to 2004, while Linda's photo still hung on the wall of the Newport Beach Police Department and her case was still listed as unsolved, James Neal committed lewd and lascivious acts against 2 young girls in Riverside County, California, 2 more children, 30 years after Linda, the same man, while the system had not yet found him. While Linda's case was still cold. In the late 1990s, Newport Beach investigators sent the biological evidence that Jim White had preserved in 1973 to a laboratory and successfully created a suspect DNA profile. In 2001, that profile was uploaded to CODIS, the FBI's National Criminal DNA Database. There was no match. James Allen Neal had never been arrested for a crime requiring DNA collection and entry into the system. The database that held the answer to Linda's case had no profile for the man who killed her. The photo stayed on the wall. The case stayed cold. On July 6, 2018, the 45th anniversary of the afternoon Linda Ann O'Keefe disappeared, the Newport Beach Police Department paused all of its regular social media content and did something no law enforcement agency in America had ever done. They spent the entire day retelling Linda's case on Twitter, not as a press release, not as a list of facts, not as a media statement asking for tips. They told it in Linda's own voice, one tweet at a time, in chronological order. Beginning on the morning of July 6, 1973, when Linda got ready for school and ending on the morning of July 7th. When her body was found, the first tweet read, "Hi, I'm Linda O'Keefe, or Linda and O'Keefe if I'm in trouble with my mum. 45 years ago today, I disappeared from Newport Beach. I was murdered and my body was found in the Back Bay. My killer was never found. Today, I'm going to tell you my story." The tweets that followed walked the reader through Linda's day. Getting dressed, going to school, the familiar walk home, the turquoise van. The moment she didn't make it to her front door, Newport Beach Police Department spokesperson Jennifer Manzella, who created the campaign, later explained the intention. She wanted people to not just read about the case, but to feel it, to walk home from school with Linda, to stand next to the turquoise van, and to understand in a visceral way what it meant that she never came home. Among the tweets that day was one that contained something new, something Newport Beach PD had been quietly working on alongside the campaign. "There is a new lead in my case. A face that comes from DNA that the killer left behind. It's technology that didn't exist back in 1973, but it might change everything today." Alongside the Twitter campaign, Newport Beach PD released a suspect sketch not created from the witness description from 1973, but from the DNA itself, using phenotype prediction technology developed by Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based forensic DNA company. Scientists had reconstructed a facial image of the man who killed Linda from the biological evidence Jim White had preserved 45 years earlier, not a witness drawing. A DNA portrait, the combination of Linda's story told in her own voice and the release of that DNA-generated face reached millions of people far beyond Newport Beach. Far beyond California, the case that had sat cold for 45 years was suddenly everywhere and behind the scenes. Newport Beach PD had already taken the next step, the one the Twitter campaign was designed to accelerate. In 2018, while the Twitter campaign was generating a wave of national media attention, Newport Beach PD had quietly partnered with Parabon Nanolabs and Cease Moore, a genetic genealogist who had already worked on dozens of cold cases across the country using a technique that was reshaping what was possible in criminal investigations. The suspect DNA profile, created from the evidence Jim White had preserved in 1973, was uploaded to Familitranea, a public genealogy database where millions of Americans voluntarily submit their own DNA to search for distant relatives and build family trees. The database did not look for an exact match. It looked for partial matches, people who shared segments of DNA with the suspect, suggesting they were distant relatives, second cousins, third cousins, people who had never met the man who killed Linda O'Keefe, but shared a bloodline with him. From those partial matches, Moore and her team built family trees tracing lineages forward through generations until the trees converged on a single individual who matched the age, geography, and physical profile of the man in the turquoise van. In January 2019, the result came back. The family tree pointed to James Allen Neal, a 72-year-old man living in Monument, Colorado, who had lived in Orange County, California in the early 1970s under the name James Albert Layden Jr. Investigators did not move immediately. They placed Neal under surveillance. Using traditional techniques, they collected a DNA sample he left behind in the course of his daily activities. Without his knowledge and without a confrontation, that sample was sent to the laboratory. The result was a complete match. The DNA James Allen Neal had left in Monument, Colorado in 2018 matched the DNA collected from Linda O'Keefe's body in Newport Beach in 1973 at T6:30 in the morning on February 19, 2019. 45 years, 7 months, and 13 days after Linda Ann O'Keefe did not come home from summer school, James Allen Neal was arrested in Colorado Springs, Colorado. He was 72 years old. On February 20, 2019, the Newport Beach Police Department and the Orange County District Attorney's Office held a press conference. The man reading the announcement to cameras was Orange County DA Todd Spitzer, who had been 12 years old in 1973 when Linda was killed. Nearly the same age as Linda, he had grown up in Southern California. While her case was a story the community never forgot, Spitzer said, "This significant arrest is a confirmation that we never give up on solving cold cases. The unity of the community for justice, the cooperation of local law enforcement, And the use of strategic investigative tools like DNA are what helped find the answer for this family and this community. Newport Beach Police Chief John Lewis said, "Linda never made it home that afternoon. For 45 years, generations of our investigators never gave up. We never forgot Linda." Neil was extradited to California and charged with 1 count of murder with the special circumstances of kidnapping and committing lewd and lascivious acts on a child under 14. He was also charged with sexually assaulting the 2 young girls in Riverside County from 1995 to 2004. If convicted, he faced a minimum sentence of life in prison without parole. Linda's 2 sisters told reporters the arrest was bittersweet. Their parents, Linda's mother and father, were not alive to see it. James Allen Neal never stood trial. On May 25, 2020, Neal was taken from Orange County Jail to a nearby hospital due to an undisclosed illness, confirmed by police as unrelated to COVID-19. On May 27, 2020, James Allen Neal died at the age of 73. There was no trial, no verdict, no moment where Linda's family sat in a courtroom and heard the word guilty spoken out loud. DA Todd Spitzer said, "James Neal's death before he could be brought to trial robbed the O'Keefe family of the justice they deserved." The Linda O'Keefe case leaves 3 lessons that anyone connected to a cold case or anyone who cares about justice needs to understand. The first lesson belongs to Jim White. In 1973, Jim White collected and preserved biological evidence from Linda O'Keefe's body at a time when DNA technology in criminal investigations did not exist. He could not have known what that evidence would one day become. He did not know about genetic genealogy or DNA portraits or family tree. He simply knew that evidence must be kept. That single act of professional discipline, preserving biological material from a crime scene in 1973, became, 46 years later, the only reason this case was ever solved. If you have a loved one who is a cold case victim, there is one question worth asking the investigating agency directly: has the biological evidence from this case been ray-tested using modern DNA technology? Because the answer to that question could be the difference between a case remaining cold and a killer finally being identified. The second lesson belongs to the Newport Beach Police Department's 2018 Twitter campaign. When Newport Beach PD launched that campaign, they had no new leads, no new witnesses, no new evidence had emerged. All they had was a 45-year-old question and a willingness to ask it in a completely new way, in Linda's own voice, on a platform that hadn't existed for most of those 45 years. That campaign generated the public pressure that accelerated the partnership with Parabon Nanolabs, which led to the genetic genealogy search, which produced the name in January 2019. The breakthrough did not come from new evidence. It came from a new way of asking an old question. The third lesson is the hardest one. From 1995 to 2004, while Linda's case sat cold and her photo stayed on the wall, James Allen Neal continued to sexually assault 2 more young girls in Riverside County, California. A cold case is not just delayed justice for the victim. It is an open door for the perpetrator. Every year a killer remains unidentified is another year in which the same harm can reach another family. That is not an abstraction. In this case, it happened twice. If you've watched this far, leave a comment and let us know where you're watching from. And hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one.